You're standing in a stone corridor. 10 armed men surround you. They know who you are. They know what you've done. And they believe you're no longer dangerous. What happens in the next 11 seconds will be studied for decades. But right now, none of that exists. Right now, there's only this, the space between your breath and theirs. The distance between compliance and commitment. The moment before everything accelerates. Do you wait for rescue that isn't coming? Or do you decide the outcome yourself? The man is 52 years old. His hands are empty. He's outnumbered 10 to 1 in a fortified position he cannot escape. He has no weapon. No backup. No communication. The men around him are trained soldiers carrying loaded rifles with fixed bayonets. By every tactical measure, the situation is resolved. He is captured. They are in control. The next step is simple: transfer him to a holding cell, process the detention, move forward with interrogation protocol. This is not a firefight. This is administration. The corridor is narrow. Maybe 8 feet wide. Stone walls. One exit behind the soldiers. One stairwell ahead, also blocked. The geometry eliminates options. There is no flanking route. No cover. No concealment. The soldiers stand in a loose formation. Not quite at attention, but not relaxed either. Their weapons are held casually. Muzzles angled slightly downward. Not quite on the prisoner, but not quite away. They're waiting for orders. The tension in the room isn't fear. It's bureaucratic pause. And then something shifts. What should happen next is obvious. A senior officer should arrive. Formal custody should be established. Paperwork should begin. The man should be escorted under guard to a secure location where proper military detention procedures can be followed. That's doctrine. That's training. That's how these things work. But the man doesn't wait for the officer. He takes one step forward. Not a lunge. Not an attack. Just one measured step, as if testing the floor. As if checking his balance. The soldiers don't react immediately because the movement doesn't register as hostile. It looks like repositioning. Like compliance. Like a man adjusting his stance because standing still is uncomfortable. But something about the step is wrong. It's too controlled. Too deliberate. There's no hesitation in it. No questioning. It doesn't look like a man accepting his situation. It looks like a man entering his workspace. One of the soldiers shifts his grip on his rifle. Not raising it. Just adjusting. His index finger moves closer to the trigger guard. Not inside it. Just closer. The man notices. His eyes don't move toward the soldier, but his shoulders adjust. Fractionally. Almost imperceptibly. 3 seconds have passed. The soldiers are still processing. Still categorizing. Still deciding whether this requires a verbal command or physical correction. Their training tells them to establish verbal control first. To give a warning. To maintain the appearance of professional restraint. They have the guns. They have the numbers. They have the position. Warning him costs nothing. Except time. The man's right hand moves. Fast. Not toward a weapon, because there is no weapon. Toward the nearest soldier. The soldier is 23 years old. He's been trained for this. His rifle is in his hands. His finger is near the trigger. He has every advantage. But his rifle is pointed at the ground. And the man is already inside his reach. What happens next takes 1 second. The man's hand closes on the barrel of the rifle. He doesn't pull it toward himself. He pushes it down and to the side, trapping it against the soldier's own hip. The angle makes it impossible to bring the muzzle up. The soldier tries to step back, but the corridor is too narrow and there's another soldier directly behind him. The man drives his left elbow into the soldier's throat. Not a punch. An elbow. Compact. Structural. Delivered from 6 inches away with the entire rotation of his torso behind it. The soldier goes down. Not unconscious. Choking. His hands release the rifle to clutch his throat. The man takes the rifle. 4 seconds have passed. The other 9 soldiers react. But they don't react together. 3 of them raise their weapons immediately. 2 shout commands. 1 steps backward into the man behind him. 2 freeze. 1 starts to raise his weapon but hesitates because the first soldier is still falling and blocking the line of fire. It's not panic. It's cognitive lag. The situation changed faster than their decision-making cycle could process. The man doesn't aim the rifle. He swings it. The wooden stock connects with the closest soldier's jaw. That soldier drops. The man keeps the rifle moving in the same arc and drives the bayonet into the third soldier's abdomen. Not a stab. A thrust. Using the length of the rifle as a lever. The soldier screams and collapses. 2 soldiers fire. The shots are wild. 1 round hits stone. The other hits the wall. The corridor is filling with smoke and the sound is deafening and no one can see clearly anymore. The man moves forward. Not charging. Advancing. Methodically. He reverses the rifle and fires once. A soldier falls. He fires again. Another soldier falls. 7 seconds have passed. The remaining soldiers break. Not all at once. Not in unison. But sequentially. 1 turns and runs. Then another. Then 3 more. They don't throw down their weapons. They don't surrender. They simply decide that this corridor, right now, is not survivable. 2 soldiers remain. Their position near the exit. They have clear shots. They raise their rifles. The man drops to 1 knee and fires twice. Both soldiers go down. The corridor is silent except for the sound of men breathing. Some of that breathing is ragged. Some of it is wet. Some of it is stopping. 11 seconds have elapsed since the first movement. 10 soldiers entered this corridor with loaded rifles. 10 soldiers believe they were in control of a detained prisoner. 7 of them are on the ground. 3 of them ran. The man is standing. He has a rifle. He has ammunition. And the exit is now unguarded. How did this happen? Let's reconstruct this with precision. Not the mythology. Not the summary. The actual mechanics. The initial formation was not a defensive perimeter. It was a detention escort. The soldiers were positioned for control, not combat. Their spacing was wrong for a firefight. They were standing too close to each other, optimized for preventing escape, not for mutual covering fire. When the man moved, he didn't move toward the weakest soldier. He moved toward the nearest soldier. The distinction matters. The nearest soldier happened to be in a position where his body would block the other's line of fire. But this wasn't luck. The man chose that moment because that soldier was isolated by geometry. The rifle grab wasn't a disarm. Not technically. Disarming implies removing a weapon from an opponent's control. The man didn't try to pull the rifle away. He used it as an anchor point. By controlling the barrel and pushing it down, he turned the soldier's own weapon into a liability. The soldier couldn't let go without losing his weapon entirely. He couldn't pull back without giving the man leverage. He couldn't shoot because the muzzle was pointed at his own leg. So he held on. For half a second. Which was half a second too long. The elbow strike was not improvisational. It was a trained response. Compact strikes to the throat are taught specifically for close-quarters situations where there's no room to generate punching power. The man didn't swing wildly. He used his skeletal structure and his body's rotation to deliver force without requiring space. When the first soldier fell, he created an obstacle. The second soldier had to process 2 things simultaneously, a threat and a fallen comrade. Human decision-making doesn't parallelize well under stress. The brain handles threats first, then obstacles. But in this case, the fallen comrade was also part of the threat assessment. Was he dead? Wounded? In the line of fire? That processing delay was measured in fractions of a second. But fractions of a second accumulate. The man didn't fight 10 soldiers. He fought 1 soldier, then another soldier, then another. He imposed a sequence on what should have been a simultaneous response. The soldiers couldn't coordinate because coordination requires communication, and communication requires time. The bayonet thrust wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to create noise. A man with a bayonet in his abdomen screams. That scream fills the acoustic space. It makes it harder for the other soldiers to hear commands. It adds another variable to their threat assessment. It confirms that this is no longer a detention. It's a fight. When the first shots were fired, they missed. Not because the soldiers were untrained, but because they were shooting in a confined space filled with smoke and screaming and falling bodies. Their muzzles were angled incorrectly because they'd been holding them in a carry position, not a firing position. Transitioning from carry to aimed fire takes time. The man didn't give them that time. His shots didn't miss. Not because he was a better marksman, but because he fired from a kneeling position with the rifle already shouldered. He didn't aim carefully. He aimed adequately. At this range, adequate was enough. The soldiers who ran made a rational decision. They were in a corridor with limited maneuver space, degraded visibility, compromised command, and a hostile who had already demonstrated lethality. Staying meant dying. Running meant surviving. They ran. But this raises a question you should be asking. Who was this man? We'll get there. But not yet. Because understanding who he was doesn't explain what happened. Plenty of trained men have been in similar situations. Most of them died. Some of them surrendered. What made this moment different wasn't just skill. It was something else. Something that happened before the corridor. Before the capture. Before the war. Military doctrine exists to eliminate variability. To create predictable responses to predictable situations. The soldiers in that corridor were following doctrine. Detain the prisoner. Establish custody. Maintain control. Transfer to holding. The doctrine assumes compliance. Not because soldiers are naive, but because compliance is the statistically dominant outcome. Most prisoners, even trained soldiers, surrender when outnumbered and disarmed. Resistance is irrational. The math doesn't work. But doctrine is built on statistical averages. And this man was not average. The soldiers were trained to respond to resistance. But they were trained to respond to specific types of resistance. Verbal defiance. Physical struggle during restraint. Attempted escape. They were not trained to respond to offensive violence initiated by a detained prisoner. There's a difference. Resistance is reactive. It's trying to prevent something from happening. Violence is proactive. It's making something happen. The soldiers' training prepared them to suppress resistance. To apply escalating force until compliance was achieved. But their training didn't prepare them for a prisoner who wasn't resisting capture. Who was initiating combat. This created a classification error. For the first 2 seconds, the soldiers' brains were still categorizing the man's actions as resistance. By the time they reclassified it as combat, 3 of them were already down. The tactical spacing made it worse. Doctrine calls for maintaining a perimeter around a prisoner. But perimeter spacing is designed to prevent escape, not to provide mutual covering fire. The soldiers were positioned to block exits. Not to shoot each other's threats. When the man moved inside the perimeter, he didn't break it. He weaponized it. The soldiers became obstacles to each other. Their rifles were loaded and ready. But loaded and ready in a carry position is not the same as loaded and ready in a firing position. Transitioning between the two requires specific movements. Bring the stock to the shoulder, acquire sight picture, confirm target, press trigger. Each step takes time. And each step assumes you have space to complete it. The man eliminated space. He operated inside the minimum effective range of the rifles. Too close to shoot without risking hitting each other. Too close to use the length of the rifle as an advantage. But not too close to use it as a bludgeon. The soldiers had bayonets fixed. Doctrine. But a bayonet on the end of a rifle is only effective at a specific range. Too far away, and you can't reach the target. Too close, and the length of the rifle prevents you from maneuvering. The man operated at the range where bayonets became liabilities. When the shooting started, the soldiers followed their training. Return fire. Suppress the threat. Establish fire superiority. But their training assumed open terrain, defined sectors of fire, clear lines of sight. The corridor provided none of these. Their training also assumed that the enemy would react to suppressive fire by taking cover. That's what enemies do. They seek protection. They reduce their exposure. The man didn't take cover. He advanced. This violated the soldier's tactical expectation. Suppressive fire is supposed to create time. Time to reposition. Time to coordinate. Time to bring overwhelming force to bear. But the man didn't give them time. He used their suppressive fire as concealment. The muzzle flashes created visual disruption. The sound created acoustic disruption. The smoke created physical disruption. He moved through all three. By the time the soldiers realized their fire was ineffective, they'd already expended ammunition and created more chaos. The three soldiers who ran weren't cowards. They were tacticians. They recognized that the situation had degraded beyond Doctrine's capacity to resolve it. Their options were to stay and die following a plan that was no longer working, or leave and survive. They chose survival. But their departure created a secondary failure. Once three soldiers left, the others perceived that departure. Perception of retreat triggers psychological contagion. If trained soldiers are leaving, perhaps leaving is the correct response. The remaining two soldiers stayed because they hadn't processed the departure yet. They were focused on the immediate threat. By the time they might have considered leaving, they were down. This tells us something. Doctrine works until it doesn't. And it stops working the moment the enemy refuses to behave like the enemy is supposed to behave. But that still doesn't answer the core question. How did he know to do this? How did he know that moving first, moving fast, and moving forward would break their response cycle? Was it training? Experience? Instinct? Or was it something else? There's a concept in military psychology called the action-reaction gap. It's the delay between observing a threat and responding to it. In trained soldiers, this gap is measured in milliseconds. Hundreds of milliseconds, but still milliseconds. The man in the corridor understood this gap. Not academically. Viscerally. He'd been in combat before. Not once. Many times. Enough times that his nervous system had been rewired. His threat recognition was faster than average. His motor responses were faster than average. His willingness to commit violence was faster than average. But speed alone doesn't explain what happened. Plenty of fast soldiers have been killed by slower soldiers who had better positioning. What made the difference was his decision calculus. Most people, even trained soldiers, operate on a risk avoidance model. They assess danger and try to minimize exposure to it. This is rational. This is survival instinct. But the man had inverted the model. He didn't assess risk to avoid it. He assessed risk to manage it. The distinction is subtle but critical. Risk avoidance says identify the danger, reduce exposure, wait for advantage. Risk management says identify the danger, control the variables, force the outcome. In that corridor, risk avoidance would have meant compliance. Wait for transfer. Wait for holding. Wait for an opportunity with better odds. Risk management meant recognizing that the odds would never improve. That every moment of delay increased the enemy's organization. That the best opportunity was right now, before the senior officer arrived, before the formation tightened, before the situation stabilized. So he didn't wait. But there's another layer. Most soldiers, when they commit violence, experience a psychological delay. A moment of hesitation. A fractional pause where the brain double-checks the decision. Am I sure? Is this necessary? Is there another option? This hesitation is normal. It's part of being human. It's part of having a functioning moral architecture. The man didn't hesitate. Not because he lacked morality. But because he'd already made the decision before the moment arrived. The decision wasn't, should I fight? The decision was, when they give me the opportunity, I will fight. The opportunity was the first soldier's positioning. The moment was the first step. Everything after that was execution. This is what separates survivors from casualties in close-quarters violence. Not strength. Not speed. Not even skill. Decision resolution. The soldiers were still deciding. The man had already decided. His breathing didn't spike. Witnesses reported that after the engagement, he wasn't hyperventilating. His hands weren't shaking. He didn't display the physiological markers of panic or adrenaline dump. This suggests something unsettling. His nervous system didn't interpret the event as an emergency. It interpreted it as a task. There's a documented phenomenon in veteran combat personnel called affective flattening. After sufficient exposure to life-threatening violence, the autonomic nervous system stops treating it as exceptional. The fight-or-flight response becomes muted. The emotional peaks flatten. This isn't courage. It's adaptation. The nervous system learns that panic doesn't improve survival. So it stops panicking. The man's nervous system had learned this lesson years before the corridor. But adaptation cuts both ways. The same flattening that allows rapid violence also creates psychological distance. The capacity to kill without hesitation requires the capacity to dehumanize the target. Not consciously. Not ideologically. But functionally. In that corridor, the man didn't see 10 enemy soldiers. He saw 10 obstacles to his survival. The distinction matters. Soldiers have names, families, humanity. Obstacles have positions, vulnerabilities, removal sequences. When he struck the first soldier's throat, he wasn't ending a life. He was removing obstacle 1. When he thrust the bayonet, he wasn't causing pain. He was creating acoustic disruption and visual chaos. This cognitive reframing is how functional psychopathy operates in combat. It's not a personality disorder. It's a tactical mindset. And it's trainable. The question is, should it be? The event was documented. Multiple surviving soldiers gave consistent testimony. The physical evidence was unambiguous. 7 casualties. 3 retreated. 1 man standing. The military investigators arrived expecting to find evidence of external assistance. A hidden weapon. A coordinated ambush. Some explanation that fit within normal operational parameters. They found none. The after-action report concluded that the man had exploited tactical overconfidence and suboptimal positioning to achieve temporary combat superiority despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. That's bureaucratic language for, he shouldn't have won, but he did. The report made 14 specific recommendations. Most of them focused on detention protocols. Revised spacing requirements. Mandatory weapon orientation during prisoner transfer. Enhanced restraint procedures. But 3 recommendations were different. They addressed something harder to quantify. Recommendation 11. Detention personnel should be trained to recognize and respond to offensive prisoner violence as a distinct category from resistant behavior. Recommendation 12. Psychological profiling should be implemented to identify high-risk detainees with demonstrated close-quarters combat experience. Recommendation 13. Rules of engagement during detention should be clarified to permit immediate lethal response to offensive violence regardless of prisoner status. These recommendations were never fully implemented. Implementation would have required acknowledging that the existing detention doctrine had a fundamental vulnerability. That trained soldiers could be killed by a single unarmed prisoner if that prisoner possessed specific psychological and tactical characteristics. Acknowledging this would have implications. It would mean that prisoner status doesn't eliminate threat status. That disarmament doesn't guarantee control. That capture doesn't mean victory. It would mean that some men remain dangerous regardless of the tactical situation. The man's own military service record was reviewed. Classified sections were declassified for the investigation. What emerged was a pattern. For previous instances of close-quarters combat. All documented. All successful. All characterized by the same tactical approach, immediate violence, constant forward momentum, exploitation of decision-making lag. In one instance, he'd been surrounded by 6 hostile soldiers in a bombed-out building. He'd killed 4 and wounded 2 using only an entrenching tool. In another instance, he'd been pinned down by machine gun fire with no avenue of retreat. He'd closed the distance to the machine gun position and killed the three-man crew with his bare hands and their own weapons. The pattern was clear. This wasn't luck. This wasn't improvisation. This was a refined methodology. The investigators asked the obvious question: why wasn't this man flagged as high risk during detention? The answer was simple: he'd been flagged. The senior officer who was supposed to oversee his transfer had been delayed. The soldiers in the corridor were supposed to hold him for 7 minutes until proper high-risk protocols could be implemented. They held him for 11 seconds. The military response had two components: public and internal. Publicly, the incident was framed as a lesson in vigilance. The casualties were honored. The detention protocols were updated. The man was condemned as a war criminal who had violated the laws of armed conflict by attacking soldiers conducting lawful detention. Internally, the incident was studied. The tactical breakdown was analyzed. The decision points were mapped. The psychological factors were documented. And the man became a case study. Not because he was exceptional, but because he represented a type. A category of combatant that Doctrine struggled to address. Soldiers are trained to fight other soldiers. To respond to organized violence with organized violence. To apply superior firepower and maneuver to achieve tactical objectives. But this man wasn't fighting like a soldier. He was fighting like something else. Something older. Something that existed before Doctrine. Before formations. Before rules. He was fighting like a predator in a cage. And the cage had been opened. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader phenomenon that military historians have documented across multiple conflicts and multiple eras. The corridor engagement shares structural similarities with at least 17 other documented cases where a single combatant defeated a superior force in close quarters. The common elements are consistent: confined space, numerical superiority, initial control, sudden violence, cascading failure. But there's another pattern. In every documented case, the single combatant had prior close-quarters combat experience. Not training. Experience. Actual violence against actual humans in actual life-threatening situations. This suggests something that military training establishments resist acknowledging. You cannot train someone to be lethal. You can only train them to survive enough violent encounters that they become lethal through adaptation. Lethality is not a skill. It's a psychological state. The man in the corridor had been in that state before. Multiple times. His nervous system had calibrated itself to operate in that environment. His decision-making had compressed to the point where thought and action were nearly simultaneous. When he took that first step, he wasn't thinking, "I will now execute a combat sequence." He was thinking movement, and his body was already executing. This kind of compression is what martial artists call mushin, or no mind. What fighter pilots call being in the zone. What psychologists call flow state. But those terms make it sound peaceful, meditative, optimal. It's not. It's violence operating at its maximum efficiency. It's the human nervous system running a combat algorithm without conscious oversight. It's what happens when survival has been practiced enough times that it becomes automatic. And it's terrifying to face. The soldiers in that corridor were trained. They were competent. They were following Doctrine. But they were facing something Doctrine doesn't have a good answer for: a human being who had crossed the psychological threshold from soldier to weapon. Soldiers have inhibitions. Soldiers have decision trees. Soldiers have rules of engagement. Weapons have none of these. The man wasn't constrained by what he should do. He was only executing what would work. In conflicts where conventional forces face unconventional combatants, this pattern repeats. The conventional force has superior firepower, superior numbers, superior logistics. But they're operating within a framework of rules and procedures. The unconventional combatant has none of that. They have only the will to violence, and the experience to implement it. When these two forces meet in close quarters, the framework often loses. Not because the conventional force is weak, but because the framework assumes that both sides are operating within similar cognitive constraints. When one side isn't, the framework becomes a liability. The military's response to this pattern has been to tighten procedures, to add more checkpoints, more restraints, more layers of control. But procedures require time. Restraints require compliance. Control requires cooperation. And the men who exist in that psychological state don't cooperate. They decide. Let's return to the corridor with a different question. How close did this come to failing? Very close. If the first soldier had stepped back instead of holding the rifle, the man would have been exposed with no weapon and 10 soldiers with clear shots. If the second soldier had been positioned 1 meter to the left, the bayonet thrust would have missed, and the man would have been in the middle of a formation with only a rifle stock as a weapon. If one of the wild shots had hit him, the engagement would have ended immediately. If the 3 soldiers who ran had instead moved to flanking positions, they could have created crossfire and ended the situation. If the senior officer had arrived 30 seconds earlier, high-risk protocols would have been in place and the man would never have had the opportunity. Any of these variables, if changed, would have resulted in his death or recapture. The outcome wasn't inevitable. It was contingent. And it was balanced on fractions of seconds and centimeters of positioning. This is what analysts mean when they say the engagement was tactically fragile. It worked. But it almost didn't work. And the margin between success and failure was so narrow that replicating it would be nearly impossible. The man understood this. After the engagement, he didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply moved. He exited the corridor, secured the stairwell, and continued his escape. He knew that he'd won a battle, not a war. That every second he remained in the building increased the probability of encountering reinforcements. That his advantage existed only in that specific moment under those specific conditions. Outside those conditions, he was still one man with a rifle and limited ammunition in the middle of enemy territory. He moved. The soldiers who ran made it to the command post and reported the incident. Within 4 minutes, reaction forces were mobilized. Within 8 minutes, the building was surrounded. Within 12 minutes, a systematic search was underway. They never found him. He'd already left the building. Already changed his appearance. Already blended into the civilian population. The corridor gave him 11 seconds of tactical superiority. He turned those 11 seconds into enough time to escape the immediate kill zone. And he turned that escape into survival. But it was close. If the search had been initiated 2 minutes earlier, they would have caught him in the street. If a patrol had been positioned on the exit route, they would have intercepted him. The variables that saved him weren't just the ones in the corridor. They were the ones that came after. The delayed response. The communication lag. The assumption that a detailed prisoner couldn't have gotten far. Every assumption worked in his favor. But any of them could have failed. This is the nature of close-quarters violence. It's not deterministic. It's probabilistic. The most skilled combatant can be killed by a lucky shot. The best plan can be undone by random chance. What the man had wasn't a guarantee of success. It was a methodology for maximizing probability. He couldn't control whether the first soldier would react correctly. But he could control the speed and precision of his own actions. He couldn't control whether the wild shots would hit him. But he could control his positioning to minimize exposure. He couldn't eliminate risk. But he could manage it. And in that corridor, for 11 seconds, his risk management was better than theirs. The man survived. He evaded capture. He eventually made it back to friendly territory. There was no medal ceremony. No public recognition. No triumphant return. Because what he'd done, while tactically brilliant, was also legally questionable. Attacking soldiers who were conducting lawful detention violated multiple articles of the laws of armed conflict. The fact that he was a prisoner at the time complicated his status. Was he a combatant exercising his right to escape? Or was he a prisoner conducting an unlawful attack? The lawyers argued. The politicians debated. The military leadership stayed silent. In the end, nothing happened. No charges. No decorations. No official acknowledgement. He was quietly reassigned. Kept away from public affairs. Kept away from media. Kept away from situations where someone might ask questions. Years later, an interviewer asked him about the corridor. His response was 4 sentences. I was captured. I escaped. Men died. I didn't. The interviewer pressed. Asked about his training, his mindset, his decision-making process. He said, there was no decision. There was only the situation. And what the situation required. The interviewer asked if he had any regrets. He said, regret requires believing there was a choice. There wasn't. And that was all he ever said publicly about it. Privately, according to declassified psychological evaluations, he showed no signs of post-traumatic stress related to the corridor engagement. No nightmares. No intrusive thoughts. No avoidance behaviors. The psychologist noted, subject displays effect consistent with someone recalling a professional task rather than a traumatic event. No indication of moral injury or psychological distress. This absence of trauma was itself notable. Most soldiers who kill in close quarters, even in clear self-defense situations, experience some degree of psychological aftermath. He experienced none. The psychologist's conclusion. Subject has likely crossed the psychological threshold where lethal violence no longer triggers autonomic stress response. This is consistent with documented cases of extreme combat exposure. Recommend monitoring but no treatment indicated. Translation: he's adapted to violence to the point where it no longer affects him. We should watch him, but he's not broken. Just changed. This brings us to the question we've been circling. What does this tell us about warfare? The corridor engagement is tactically interesting. It's psychologically revealing. It's doctrinally challenging. But it's also something else. It's a demonstration of a fundamental asymmetry in armed conflict. Institutional militaries train soldiers to operate within systems, to follow procedures, to coordinate with the units, to apply force in organized, predictable ways. This creates tremendous combat power. A well-trained military unit can project force across continents, can conduct complex combined arms operations, can sustain operations for months or years. But that institutional capability comes with institutional constraints, rules of engagement, chain of command, legal frameworks, moral expectations. Individual combatants who are not part of that institutional structure don't have those constraints. They operate on simpler calculus. Survive. Win. Escape. When institutional soldiers face individual combatants in situations where institutional advantages don't apply, no air support, no artillery, no backup, no time, the individual sometimes wins. Not because they're better soldiers, but because they're playing a different game. The military has tried to address this asymmetry. Special operations forces are trained to operate more like individuals, to make rapid decisions, to act without extensive command approval, to use violence more fluidly. But even special operations forces are still institutional. They still have rules. They still have oversight. They still have boundaries. The man in the corridor had none. He was an institutional soldier when it suited him. And he was something else when it didn't. That flexibility is powerful. It's also dangerous. Because men who can switch between institutional constraints and individual violence are hard to control. They're useful, but unpredictable. And militaries don't like unpredictability. After the corridor incident, the military's detention protocols were updated. The changes were comprehensive. High-risk prisoners were now kept in restraints during all transfers. Detention teams were increased from 10 soldiers to 15. Weapon orientation protocols were tightened. Psychological screening was enhanced. These changes made the system more robust, harder to exploit, more resistant to individual violence. But they also made the system slower, more resource-intensive, more bureaucratic. The corridor incident improved institutional security at the cost of institutional efficiency. That trade-off is the story of modern warfare. Every vulnerability that gets closed adds weight to the system. Every procedure that gets added slows response time. Every constraint that gets implemented reduces flexibility. The institutional military gets safer, but heavier. And heavy systems struggle against light opponents. We've analyzed the tactics. We've examined the psychology. We've reviewed the institutional response. We've mapped the patterns. But there's one question we haven't answered: was this justified? The soldiers were conducting a lawful detention. They weren't executing him. They weren't torturing him. They were following the laws of armed conflict. He was a prisoner. His status required compliance. His attack violated that status. From a legal standpoint, what he did was murder. But from a survival standpoint, what he did was rational. He was a soldier in enemy territory. Remaining captured meant interrogation, imprisonment, possible execution. Escaping meant survival. Most soldiers in his position would have waited. Would have hoped for rescue or exchange. Would have accepted prisoner status as preferable to death. He didn't. Was that courage? Or was that something else? The laws of armed conflict exist to limit violence, to protect noncombatants, to establish boundaries that even enemies respect. But those laws assume that both sides value something beyond victory, that both sides accept constraints in service of a larger moral framework. What happens when one side doesn't? The man in the corridor didn't reject the laws of armed conflict ideologically. He simply prioritized survival over compliance. When the two came into conflict, survival won. This creates a problem that legal frameworks struggle to address. If survival justifies breaking the laws of war, then the laws only constrain those who value something more than survival. And in close quarters life or death situations, survival is a very strong value. The soldiers who died in that corridor were following orders. They were doing their jobs. They didn't deserve to die. But deserve is a moral category. And violence doesn't respect moral categories. The man didn't kill them because they deserved it. He killed them because they were obstacles. That coldness is horrifying. It's also honest. War pretends to be about justice and righteousness and defending values. But in the corridor, none of that mattered. What mattered was who moved first, who moved faster, and who was willing to commit total violence without hesitation. The man was willing. The soldiers weren't. And that made all the difference. Let's return to where we started. You're standing in that corridor. 10 armed men surround you. You're captured. You're outnumbered. You have no weapon. Do you comply? Or do you commit? Most people would comply. Most people would calculate the odds and accept prisoner status as the least bad option. But you're not most people. You've been here before. You've felt your life compress into seconds. You've felt the moment where thought becomes action becomes survival. You know something that most people don't know: the odds don't matter. Numbers don't matter. Weapons don't matter. What matters is who decides to cross the line first. And you've already decided. That's the lesson of the corridor. Not that violence wins. Not that aggression triumphs. But that in specific situations, under specific conditions, the willingness to commit total violence immediately can overcome material disadvantage. This doesn't mean violence is always the answer. It means that when violence becomes necessary, hesitation is fatal. The soldiers hesitated. They waited for orders. They waited for the situation to clarify. They waited for the threat to become unambiguous. The man didn't wait. He recognized that the moment of maximum opportunity was the moment before anyone realized an opportunity existed. And he took it. This is what keeps military planners awake at night. Not the enemy with better technology. Not the adversary with more troops. But the opponent who refuses to be bound by the same decision-making framework. The opponent who doesn't wait. The opponent who decides. The opponent who commits. Because once that decision is made, once that commitment is locked in, the situation changes. It's no longer about tactical advantage. It's about who can adapt faster to the new reality. And adaptation requires recognizing that the reality has changed. The soldiers in the corridor were still operating in the old reality: detention, transfer, custody, when the man had already moved to the new reality: combat, survival, escape. By the time they realized the reality had changed, 3 of them were down, and the situation was irreversible. So here's the question this incident leaves us with. In a world where institutional militaries are bound by law and procedure and oversight, what happens when they face individuals who are bound only by the physics of violence? Does the institution adapt and become more like the individual? Does it tighten control and accept the inefficiency? Does it try to create soldiers who can switch between both modes? Or does it acknowledge that some situations cannot be addressed by doctrine? That some opponents cannot be contained by procedure? That some forms of violence operate outside the framework we've built to manage it? The corridor doesn't answer that question. It just demonstrates that the question is real. And that 11 seconds is enough time to change everything. If this analysis challenged your assumptions about tactical superiority and institutional control, share your perspective in the comments. If you found value in this examination of close-quarters combat psychology, consider subscribing for more detailed military analysis. And if you want to be notified when we explore other incidents where doctrine met reality and reality won, turn on notifications. The corridor isn't ancient history. It's a template. And understanding that template might matter more than you think.